The real Spartans, not just 300, but also 3,000 bad decisions. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle stroll through one of history's most misrepresented little city-states, Sparta. You've probably heard about the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, right? The brave, shirtless warriors with abs that could probably deflect arrows, or at least that's how Hollywood remembers them. But as with most history, the reality is a lot less heroic and a lot more chaotic. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's float into the dusty, sun-baked streets of ancient Sparta, where every noble decision was at least slightly questionable. Now, Sparta is famous for a lot of things. Its military, its discipline, and, well, its somewhat obsessive dedication to turning children into tiny, sociopathic warriors. The thing about Sparta is that they liked to be seen as the toughest city-state in Greece, but they also had a remarkable talent for making bad decisions. I'm talking decisions that range from politically disastrous to personally awkward, to decisions that would make even a seasoned Instagram influencer cringe. And no, it wasn't just Leonidas and his 299 bros. It was basically the entire Spartan system, kind of like an elite school where everyone learned the art of overthinking and underthinking at the same time. Let's start with the basics. Sparta was ruled by not one, but two kings. That's right, two. You might think, hey, dual leadership, sounds like a clever idea. But it was mostly just two guys getting in each other's way while the city-state simultaneously got itself into trouble. The kings had military roles, and yes, they were expected to lead troops into battle. But unlike the dramatic Hollywood version, these kings didn't always inspire loyalty with heroic speeches or epic facial hair. They sometimes inspired confusion and occasionally mutiny by, for example, deciding that yes, it would be brilliant to invade someone who wasn't even a threat yet. Spartan society also had this charming little obsession with babies. And by obsession, I mean they inspected newborns like they were inspecting livestock at a market. Babies deemed unfit were abandoned on Mount Taygetus. Don't worry too much, they believed it was for the greater good because weak children wouldn't make for tough warriors. Modern psychology would probably frown on that, but in the context of Sparta, it was basically a brutal form of quality control. Imagine family gatherings where everyone casually remarks about which cousin was thrown off a cliff and which survived. Cozy, right? The boys who survived were then subjected to the agoge, which was Sparta's legendary educational system. And by educational, I mean a constant test of survival skills, obedience, and whether you could convince older boys not to hurt you too badly. From age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and raised collectively by the state. This might sound like a team-building exercise gone horribly wrong, and that's because it kind of was. They learned everything from hunting to stealth to memorizing long lists of rules, many of which had more to do with impressing older boys than anything actually useful in adulthood. Girls, meanwhile, had their own version of Spartan education. Yes, girls. They were encouraged to exercise, stay strong, and in general, not faint at the sight of someone carrying a spear, because nothing says prepared for marriage than a young woman who can outlift her future husband. The reasoning was simple. Healthy, strong mothers would produce strong children, and the cycle of questionable decisions would continue. So Sparta essentially had this entire population trained like a bizarre, slightly unhinged fitness cult, all under the guise of national survival.
Now let's float over to Sparta's politics, which, spoiler alert, were not exactly smooth. The city-state had a council of elders called the Gerousia, consisting of men over 60, and a popular assembly. Sounds balanced, right? Except the elders were usually set in their ways, and the assembly had very little actual power. So most decisions were basically a polite way of older men nodding at each other, while the younger population silently panicked about yet another war. And yes, Sparta was almost always at war, or at least planning one, because apparently that's what you do when your whole society is built around producing warriors. Speaking of war, let's address Thermopylae, because we can't not. The famous 300 Spartans were real, but they were accompanied by thousands of other Greeks. And yet, history, mostly thanks to cinematic license, decided we should focus on the 300, because obviously a smaller number of shirtless men makes for better drama than a larger, slightly messy group. But the interesting thing about the real story is that it's less about heroism and more about a kind of collective, stubborn mismanagement. The Spartans had a strategy, sure, but they were vastly outnumbered, and the delay they caused was tactically useful, but also, let's be honest, a little suicidal. It's like meticulously planning a road trip with a 90% chance your car won't start, and still doing it anyway. Even Spartan kings were not immune to questionable choices. Take Cleomenes I, for example. He tried to reform the political system to consolidate power, because apparently 2 kings and a council wasn't complicated enough. He made enemies, got involved in messy intrigues, and eventually the story ends with him committing suicide quietly, in a way that was both tragic and somewhat anticlimactic. The point here is that Spartan leadership often involved a lot of posturing, a fair amount of drama, and outcomes that could generously be described as mildly disastrous. And the culture itself encouraged this. Spartans were obsessed with honor, which sounds fine until you realize their definition of honor was more about appearances and toughness than practicality. They had a saying, "Come back with your shield or on it," which is lovely for slogans, but not exactly helpful if your strategy involves not getting killed. So while they certainly cultivated resilience, they also glorified decisions that were spectacularly unwise by any other metric. So far, we've touched on political chaos, education that doubled as a sort of endurance torture, and a culture that romanticized risky behavior. But there's more. Social customs that probably raise eyebrows today. For instance, Spartans often engaged in secretive or ritualized homosexual relationships, especially among soldiers. The reasoning was partly practical, bonding troops together, and partly cultural, which made for a society that was incredibly disciplined, but also, from a modern perspective, confusingly intimate. And let's not forget the economy, or rather, the lack thereof. Sparta famously despised trade and wealth accumulation. Gold coins? Poof! Instead, they used cumbersome iron bars. Practicality? Not really. They just liked the idea that wealth couldn't corrupt them, even as they continually engaged in what we might call resourceful theft from neighboring communities. So while they were philosophically above greed, they were also inventively opportunistic when it suited them. By now, you might be wondering if Sparta was more tragic than heroic, and you'd be correct. The city-state was meticulously organized, yes, but also constantly teetering on the brink of internal collapse, largely because every decision was filtered through layers of honor, pride, and tradition. And as with most human endeavors, even the best intentions often resulted in embarrassment or outright failure. So as we drift through these sun-baked hills, imagine thousands of Spartan citizens, children enduring the agoge, kings plotting reforms, elders wringing their hands, soldiers standing in phalanx formations, all operating under a system that prized toughness and spectacle over practicality. It was orderly, yes, but also deeply flawed, a kind of historical cautionary tale about over-engineering society for one specific purpose. And that purpose? Producing warriors, because apparently that was worth every awkward political decision, every abandoned infant, and every iron bar economy. Before we move on, let's pause for a moment and consider the paradox at the heart of Sparta. They were admired for discipline and feared for military prowess, yet most of their famous moments, like Thermopylae, were as much about stubbornness as brilliance. The 300 Spartans became immortalized not just because they were brave, but because their society had trained them to be brave, and also, perhaps, a little oblivious to the consequences. And with that, we've gently eased into the messy, fascinating, slightly absurd world of Sparta. The takeaway? They were not perfect, they were not particularly subtle, and they certainly were not just the 300 warriors you've heard about in movies. They were a civilization built on contradictions, disciplined yet reckless, austere yet obsessive, heroic yet fundamentally human in their constant capacity for error.
Kings, generals, and questionable orders. Welcome back, everyone. If you've been following along, we've already wandered through the dusty streets of Sparta, glimpsed the awkward brilliance of its society, and maybe felt a bit sorry for the babies abandoned on Mount Taygetus. Tonight, we're going a little deeper. We're going to meet the actual people, the kings, the generals, and the aristocrats who were supposedly running the show, but mostly seemed to be perfecting the art of making slightly terrible choices. Let's begin with Leonidas I, the most famous Spartan king you've probably heard about. Yes, the Thermopylae guy. In reality, Leonidas was both impressive and oddly overqualified for disaster. He inherited the throne as part of the dual kingship system, which meant he had to share power with his cousin, because why not complicate a monarchy with another king? Leonidas' famous decision to take 300 men to Thermopylae was strategic, but also, let's be honest, slightly dramatic. He had several thousand more troops available from other Greek city-states, but he chose the iconic 300. It made for great storytelling centuries later, but at the time, it was like sending your friends to a very public and very slightly doomed barbecue. Leonidas' other claim to fame, aside from heroics, was his personal life, or at least what little we know of it. He had a wife named Gorgo, who was apparently both clever and politically savvy. She advised him on certain domestic and state matters, which is noteworthy because Spartan kings were not exactly known for domestic brilliance. It's comforting to imagine Leonidas nodding solemnly at her advice while plotting military maneuvers, because clearly multitasking in the 7th century was a thing. Now, moving to Cleomenes I, Leonidas' predecessor and one of Sparta's more ambitious monarchs. Ambitious, in this case, translates roughly to consistently creating problems for himself and his city. Cleomenes had a habit of meddling in politics beyond what was strictly necessary. He attempted reforms to strengthen the king's power and reduce the influence of the Gerousia and the ephors. Basically, he wanted to centralize authority, which sounds good on paper until you remember that politics in Sparta, like everywhere else, involves a lot of stubborn, grumpy old men who do not enjoy centralization. The outcome? Cleomenes made enemies, got involved in messy intrigues, and ultimately, well, chose to end his life quietly rather than deal with the fallout. A sad end, but predictably messy for anyone daring to shake up Sparta's rigid political machine. Speaking of the ephors, these 5 elected officials often get ignored in casual histories of Sparta, but they deserve a mention here. Ephors could veto decisions by the kings, oversee foreign policy, and more or less run day-to-day life. They were supposedly checks on royal power, but in practice, they were the bureaucrats of doom. Many ephors used their position for petty rivalries, personal grudges, and subtle sabotage. Imagine 5 middle-aged men in togas sitting around an ancient city council, quietly undermining a king because someone insulted their sandals last week. Spartan generals were no less prone to questionable judgment. Take Brasidas, a brilliant commander in his own right, who managed to inspire both fear and admiration during the Peloponnesian War. He was tactical, courageous, and clever, yet even he had his missteps. For instance, he sometimes acted without full consultation, leading to victories that were impressive but strategically messy in the long term. Picture a man winning a battle, but accidentally destabilizing an entire region. Still a win, but with side effects that no one bothered to read the manual for.
And then there's Pleistorchus, Leonidas' son, who inherited the throne as a toddler. That's right, Sparta had a system for child kings. Pleistorchus technically ruled, but everyone else made the actual decisions. It's like being handed the keys to a sports car at age 2. You're the king, sure, but mostly you just sit in the driver's seat while everyone else handles the braking and steering. Which brings us to the broader problem in Sparta. Succession planning was charmingly impractical. A child king meant regents and advisors running the show, which always opens the door to, let's call it a small cascade of avoidable errors. We should also touch on military innovation, or at least Sparta's willingness to commit to traditions that weren't always practical. The phalanx formation, for instance, was ingenious on paper. Rows of men, spears out, shields locked, moving as one. But in reality, maintaining strict formation under pressure requires impeccable discipline, and human beings are notoriously bad at that. Add in the occasional miscommunication or overconfidence, and you have a system that's only occasionally brilliant and frequently a logistical headache. There's also the fact that Spartan strategy relied so heavily on shock and awe that diplomacy often got neglected, because why negotiate when you can just charge at your neighbor with pointy sticks? Now, the Spartans' foreign policy deserves a brief, sleepy glance. They were famously isolationist in peacetime and aggressive in wartime, which means Sparta was constantly involved in conflicts that were, from a modern perspective, kind of unnecessary. Border skirmishes, invasions of smaller city-states, and occasional interventions in other Greek affairs created a culture where making a minor error could escalate into years of conflict. And yes, many of these conflicts ended predictably badly, sometimes costing thousands of lives over disputes that probably could have been solved with a slightly firmer handshake. Another charming habit of Spartan kings and generals was their tendency towards stubbornness. They prized courage, loyalty, and the ability to stick to a plan, even when that plan was clearly failing. History often celebrates this as bravery, but in the day-to-day context, it also meant a lot of resources wasted, minor rebellions, and the occasional public humiliation. Leonidas' Thermopylae stunt? Brave, yes. Strategically perfect? Not quite. Many other Spartan leaders had similar moments: confident, disciplined, stubborn, and just a touch oblivious. We also have to mention internal rebellions, which were a constant feature of Spartan history. The helots, who were essentially the enslaved population, periodically rose up, and each time the kings and generals responded with a mix of brutal efficiency and tactical improvisation. These uprisings were reminders that Sparta's rigid system, militarized, hierarchical, and obsessed with discipline, could backfire spectacularly if it ever underestimated the people doing all the hard labor. Many historians note that these revolts were effectively warning signs that the Spartan system, while orderly, was incredibly fragile. And then there were the ceremonial missteps, which sound trivial but mattered a lot to Spartans. Festivals, religious rites, and public displays of loyalty were tightly regulated. Missing a ritual or mismanaging a sacrifice could be considered both impious and politically unwise. Imagine being a king who accidentally performs the wrong chant and the FRs quietly side-eye you for the rest of your reign. Not deadly, but socially devastating. The combination of military discipline, political oversight, and ceremonial scrutiny created an environment where every choice was potentially a blunder, and yet the Spartans prided themselves on perfection. Finally, let's not forget the small but telling personal habits of these leaders. Spartan kings were known for austerity, but many also had hidden indulgences, wine, food, or leisurely pursuits that they couldn't exactly flaunt. A general caught enjoying a particularly soft bed might be criticized for weakness, but everyone secretly understood that it was human. These little hypocrisies punctuated a society obsessed with toughness and honor, and they serve as quiet reminders that behind the polished phalanx, the kings and generals were just humans navigating impossible expectations. So as we drift to the close of this part of our Spartan tour, here's the gentle summary. The kings, generals, and FRs of Sparta were competent, disciplined, and often admirable, but they were also stubborn, occasionally short-sighted, and frequently engaged in decisions that could charitably be described as questionable. Add in the complexities of child kings, dual monarchies, ritualistic demands, and relentless militarization, and you get a civilization that was brilliant in concept, chaotic in practice, and endlessly fascinating to imagine while lying under a soft blanket. In short, the 3,000 bad decisions of Sparta are not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, steady accumulation of choices that, while understandable within the Spartan worldview, often created more work, stress, and public embarrassment than anyone would admit at the time. And this, dear listener, is what makes Sparta endlessly compelling. Not its perfection, but its gloriously human imperfection, played out over generations of kings, generals, and bureaucrats, all convinced that the next decision would somehow solve everything. Spoiler alert, it usually didn't.
Life, agoge, and cultural quirks. Welcome back. If you're still with me, congratulations. You survived kings, generals, and their questionable strategic choices. Tonight, we float a little closer to the ground, into the day-to-day rhythm of Sparta, where society itself was a carefully engineered mix of discipline, absurdity, and slow-burning chaos. Let's start with the agoge, Sparta's legendary training system for boys. As a reminder, this began at age 7. Boys were removed from their families, because why trust parents to ruin perfectly good children, and placed in communal barracks. Here they were subjected to a combination of physical endurance, military training, and what can only be described as a highly ritualized form of psychological manipulation. The idea was to produce resilient and obedient warriors. The reality? It often produced traumatized, occasionally clever boys who could survive starvation but were socially awkward at dinner parties. The agoge emphasized endurance, stealth, and obedience. Boys were encouraged to sneak out at night, steal food, and survive harsh conditions. But, amusingly, if caught stealing, they were punished. The lesson apparently was be resourceful, but not too resourceful. Modern educators might have a lot of fun analyzing that one. Add in brutal exercise routines, endless competitions, and peer-enforced discipline, and you have a system that was effective at making soldiers, and probably very confused adults. Girls, of course, had their own form of training. Spartan women exercised regularly, built strength, and were educated in a surprisingly progressive way for ancient Greece. They were taught to manage households, property, and yes, even influence politics subtly. Spartan mothers were expected to say things like, "Come back with your shield or on it," which was less of a motivational speech and more of a reminder that personal safety was secondary to the Spartan ideal. The end result? Women who were strong, outspoken, and generally more competent than many of their male counterparts in day-to-day life. The unintended side effect? Occasional awkwardness for Spartan men who had to live up to that example. Spartan daily life also included a strict social hierarchy. At the top were the full citizens, the Spartiates, who spent their time training and supervising. Below them were the periokoi, free non-citizens who handled trade, craftsmanship, and other boring but necessary tasks. And then, of course, the helots, the serfs who performed most of the actual labor. The helots outnumbered the Spartiates, which made life tense, and also ensured a constant undercurrent of anxiety. One misstep by the Spartan military elite, and there could be revolt. To keep them in line, Spartans developed a variety of control methods, including outright intimidation, selective executions, and ritualized terror tactics that sound dramatic, but were mostly about reminding everyone who was in charge. Spartan culture had an interesting obsession with public perception. Appearance mattered, whether in battle, ritual, or daily life. Citizens were expected to maintain discipline, fitness, and composure at all times. Any lapse could be criticized, punished, or at least gossiped about. So even small mistakes, missing a communal dinner, mismanaging a ritual, or failing to maintain a beard properly, were magnified. In modern terms, it was like a society where TikTok likes determined your social survival. Now let's talk about meals, which were communal for men. The syssitia, or mess halls, were a place where Spartan men ate,
discussed politics, and probably silently judged each other's stamina. Food was simple, mostly porridge, some meat when available, and wine diluted with water. Fancy culinary innovation? Not really their thing. In fact, they prided themselves on austere meals because indulgence was considered weak. Yet somehow, despite the simplicity, the social pressure to perform well at these communal meals could be intense. Spilling porridge was basically a public embarrassment.
Another peculiar aspect was Spartan humor, or the lack thereof. They valued wit, but mostly dry, understated humor. Storytelling was calm, ironic, and often at someone else's expense. Imagine ancient stand-up comedy delivered in monotone while everyone sits perfectly still. Subtle insults, sarcasm, and clever remarks were prized more than outright jokes. This may partly explain why so many historical anecdotes about Sparta sound both tragic and faintly amusing at the same time. Spartans were also famous for their ritualized cruelty, but let's be gentle tonight. Much of it was ceremonial or symbolic, like the practice of inspecting infants or enforcing obedience through public shaming. These customs might seem harsh to us, but within the Spartan worldview, they were practical, ensuring the survival of the city-state, maintaining order, and reinforcing a culture of toughness. And yet, these practices inevitably produced some awkward and tragic consequences. Imagine a society where making a small mistake at age 8 could result in public humiliation or worse. Pressure would be intense, to say the least. We can't ignore the Spartan economy, or what passed for one. Remember those iron bars we mentioned in part 2? That was just the start. The Spartans discouraged trade, hoarding, or wealth accumulation. Luxury items were frowned upon because indulgence was considered morally weak. This led to a society where innovation in commerce was suppressed, but creativity in military or physical performance was encouraged. The unintended effect? A city-state that excelled at war, but relied heavily on other people to feed, clothe, and equip it. Religion also played a subtle, continuous role. Spartans were deeply pious, but their devotion was often practical, ceremonial, and a little performative. Festivals, sacrifices, and oracles influenced public and military life. Leaders would consult omens before making decisions, a practice that occasionally led to spectacularly poor timing. Imagine preparing for a battle only to delay because a sacred chicken pecked the wrong way. And yet, in the Spartan mind, these rituals were crucial for maintaining cosmic and civic balance. By this point, you might be sensing a pattern. Spartan society was an intricate web of rules, rituals, hierarchies, and expectations. Each choice, from a king's strategic decision to a child's performance in the agoge, was magnified in importance. Some choices were genuinely brilliant, some merely practical, and some, let's say, questionable at best. The constant interplay of discipline, stubbornness, and social pressure ensured that the city-state never ran smoothly for long, even in its so-called golden age. And finally, let's take a moment to consider the long-term consequences of Spartan life. While individual Spartans could be extraordinary warriors or wise leaders, the society as a whole gradually stagnated. Trade restrictions, rigid social structures, and relentless militarization limited innovation and adaptability. By focusing obsessively on toughness and discipline, Sparta created a civilization that was powerful in theory, sometimes heroic in practice, but remarkably fragile when faced with changing circumstances. It's almost poetic. The very system designed to ensure survival also planted the seeds of decline. So, as we gently drift to the end of this segment, imagine the daily life of a Spartan citizen. Rigorous training, communal meals, careful attention to honor, and constant oversight from elders and ephors. Picture the young boys enduring the agoge, the girls growing into strong, influential women, and the kings attempting to manage a society that was as proud as it was prone to mistakes. Every choice, every ritual, every minor misstep was part of the slow, inevitable accumulation of the 3,000 bad decisions that make Sparta so endlessly fascinating. And with that, we pause our gentle descent into the Spartan world, leaving behind the public rituals, child-rearing practices, and everyday absurdities, ready to explore in the next part the wars, diplomatic failures, and the stubborn heroics that ultimately defined the city-state.
Wars, diplomacy, and tactical missteps. Welcome back, fellow history wanderers. If you've been floating along, you've met the kings, the generals, and even endured the agoge with the boys of Sparta. Tonight, we turn our attention to the part of Sparta everyone remembers, sort of: war. Not just Thermopylae, though yes, that will appear in footnotes, but the full range of campaigns, strategic brilliance, and of course, the occasional spectacular failure that has come to define the 3,000 bad decisions theme. Let's begin with the Peloponnesian War, the big sibling to all Spartan conflicts. This was essentially a decades-long tug-of-war between Sparta and Athens, with occasional guest appearances from other city-states who like drama and bad timing. At first glance, Sparta seemed like a tactical genius: land-based warriors, disciplined formations, excellent at ambushes. And yes, they were terrifying on the battlefield. But diplomacy? Not so much. Sparta was more comfortable pointing spears than signing treaties. Their political maneuvering often relied on intimidation, alliances based on fear rather than trust, and a stubborn refusal to adapt. Take the Battle of Mantinea, for instance. Sparta won, but in a way that highlighted both their strengths and their limitations. The Spartan army, with perfect phalanx formation and discipline, crushed the opposition in tactical terms. Victory, right? Yes, but the cost was significant, and the strategic benefits minimal. Sparta had a habit of winning battles, but losing ground politically. It's like mowing the lawn perfectly while forgetting to water the flowers. Impressive, but not entirely useful. Another charming habit of Spartan military campaigns was their reliance on timing and ritual. Battles were sometimes delayed to satisfy religious observances or omens. If the sacred chicken refused to eat, or if an oracle had a vague warning, Spartan generals would pause operations. This could be clever. Patience is sometimes wise, but hilariously inconvenient. Imagine planning a city's defense and being told, "We'll wait another 3 days because the gods haven't approved yet." It's hard to picture modern generals nodding along without sarcasm, but in Sparta, this was just Tuesday. Sparta also had the occasional diplomatic hiccup. They were superb at projecting fear, but when it came to negotiations, they were rigid, literal, and occasionally tone-deaf. Their refusal to engage fully with Athenian or Persian diplomats sometimes prolonged wars unnecessarily. And when they did negotiate, they sometimes overreached, insisting on terms that were impossible or impractical. It's like haggling at a market while ignoring that the other person holds a sword. Effective in theory, awkward in practice. One of the more tragic patterns in Spartan warfare was overconfidence. They prided themselves on discipline, training, and the indomitable Spartan spirit, which sometimes led them to underestimate opponents. We've already discussed Thermopylae, where bravery was high and odds were absurd. Other campaigns followed similar patterns: small forces deployed strategically but stretched thin, ambitious maneuvers executed with precision but little room for error. Victory was always possible, but so was disaster.
And then there were minor border skirmishes, which were plentiful. Every small town or village could become a stage for Spartan intervention. Some of these skirmishes were brilliant exercises in intimidation. Others were messy affairs with high casualties and negligible strategic gain. The pattern emerges. The same city that could train disciplined warriors and execute perfect phalanxes could also be prone to absurd, preventable conflicts that cost resources, morale, and occasionally innocent bystanders. Spartan naval expeditions also deserve a nod. Traditionally, Sparta was a land power. Naval strategy, not their strongest suit. They built fleets when necessary, but these were often hastily assembled, poorly trained, or dependent on allies with their own agendas. The result? Occasional victories, frequent logistical headaches, and a general sense that the sea was best left to Athenians, who, frankly, were better at it. Yet, Sparta insisted on trying, because of pride, fear of being outshone, or a stubborn belief that swords and spears solve everything, even water travel. We should also mention Spartan alliances, which were often a source of both power and embarrassment. They allied with city-states like Corinth, Thebes, and smaller polis to counter Athenian influence. However, maintaining these alliances required negotiation, trust, and compromise, skills not exactly emphasized in the agoge. The result? Frequent disputes, rivalries, and occasional betrayals. Spartan diplomacy often resembled a delicate dance performed in heavy armor, with occasional stumbles that sent someone's toes straight into a ceremonial fountain. Now the fun part: unintended consequences. Many Spartan victories inadvertently created new problems. Subjugated cities, delayed reinforcements, or overconfidence led to revolts, rebellions, and strategic miscalculations. The irony is that Sparta, a society obsessed with preparation, discipline, and foresight, often found its meticulous plans undermined by the human element. Helots, allies, and even their own generals occasionally did things they hadn't accounted for. And yet, somehow, Sparta endured. Their combination of military skill, social engineering, and stubbornness allowed them to maintain a presence in Greece for centuries. They were neither perfect nor invincible, but they were consistent in one key way. They always stuck to their principles, even when those principles caused problems. In other words, they made bad decisions spectacularly and persistently, but they made them with style. So as we drift to the end of this part, imagine Spartan armies moving across Greece. Disciplined formations, ritualized practices, overconfident generals, minor diplomatic disasters, and occasional bursts of brilliance. Each decision, whether strategic, political, or ceremonial, added to the slow accumulation of errors that made Sparta both legendary and humanly flawed. In short, Spartan warfare was not merely about heroism or discipline. It was a dance of careful preparation, stubborn pride, and occasional misjudgment. Every battle, campaign, and diplomatic move illustrates the duality of Sparta, a society built to endure, but always on the edge of its own perfectly orchestrated chaos.
Welcome back, dear listener. By now, we've wandered through the dusty streets of Sparta, met kings, generals, and bewildered children in the agoge, and even witnessed their military campaigns that were brilliant, terrifying, and occasionally spectacularly ill-timed. Tonight, we flew into the quieter, slower part of the Spartan story, how a city-state so carefully engineered for endurance began to crumble from within. A slow-motion demonstration of what happens when consistency meets stubbornness. Let's begin with population decline, which may sound mundane, but was catastrophically important. Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were a small elite group, and their numbers gradually shrank over generations. Why? Multiple reasons. Warfare casualties, low birth rates, perhaps influenced by the agoge and the insistence on producing perfect children, and rigid social requirements that excluded many from full citizenship. Imagine a society that prides itself on producing elite warriors only to slowly run out of them. It's like building a luxury sports car factory and realizing decades later there aren't enough engineers left to assemble anything. This population problem was compounded by the Helot system. Helots, the subjugated population who farmed and did the heavy labor, vastly outnumbered the Spartiates. This imbalance created a constant undercurrent of fear. Uprisings were always a threat, requiring the city to maintain perpetual vigilance. Spartan citizens had to devote significant time and energy to controlling their workforce, which, while militarily impressive, drained resources from other priorities. In short, more manpower for war, less flexibility for long-term sustainability. Economically, Sparta was struggling too. Their disdain for trade, wealth accumulation, and luxury left them ill-equipped to adapt to changing times. As other Greek city-states grew richer, more innovative, and more connected, Sparta remained stubbornly austere. This was philosophically admirable, perhaps, but practically limiting. Resources for maintaining armies, building infrastructure, or supporting allies were constrained, leaving Sparta increasingly vulnerable to the political and military innovations of its neighbors. Another crucial factor in Sparta's decline was rigid social structures. The agoge and the militarized lifestyle produced disciplined warriors, yes, but it also created a society resistant to change. Innovation, creative problem-solving, or deviation from tradition were discouraged, meaning that as the political and military landscape of Greece evolved, Sparta often responded too slowly or inappropriately. It's the classic example of a society so committed to its ideals that it forgets to survive in the real world. Sparta's dual kingship system, which once provided checks and balances, became increasingly problematic. Competing kings sometimes pursued conflicting agendas. Generals occasionally acted independently, creating confusion and inefficiency. The ephors, intended as stabilizing forces, could also obstruct necessary reforms. Internal politics became a web of rivalries, grudges, and ceremonial obligations, often leaving the city-state paralyzed at critical moments. Let's also discuss diplomatic isolation. Sparta's pride and suspicion of outsiders meant they were slow to form durable alliances beyond the Peloponnesian League. When conflicts arose with more flexible or wealthier states, Sparta often found itself overextended and diplomatically stranded. Their strength, their discipline, cohesion, and military skill was insufficient to compensate for a lack of adaptive strategy. Imagine trying to win a chess game while refusing to look at half the board because tradition says you must only watch the squares in front of you.
The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE represents a symbolic turning point. Sparta, long thought invincible on land, faced the Thebans under Epaminondas. The result? A devastating defeat that shattered the myth of Spartan military supremacy. The Thebans used innovative tactics that Sparta's rigid formations couldn't counter. It was a quiet reminder that the city-state's centuries of discipline, bravery, and stubborn adherence to tradition could not insulate them from changing realities. Even smaller internal decisions contributed to the decline. Land distribution remained unequal, citizenship was restricted, and the pressure to maintain physical perfection continued to exclude many potentially capable individuals. Every small policy, each ceremonial ritual, each insistence on tradition reinforced a system that looked flawless in theory, but was brittle in practice. Sparta, in essence, was a beautifully crafted glass sculpture, strong in design, delicate under stress. Culturally, Sparta maintained an obsession with honor, discipline, and appearance until the very end.
While these values produced remarkable warriors and leaders, they also created a society that judged failure harshly, sometimes fatally. Courage was celebrated. Caution, compromise, or flexibility were often scorned. In a world that was changing politically, militarily, and economically, this rigidity became an Achilles heel. By the end of the classical period, Sparta's power had waned and its influence diminished. It was no longer the city-state that commanded fear and respect across Greece. Its warriors remained impressive in small skirmishes, but the social, political, and economic structures that had supported its centuries-long dominance were eroding. What remained was a proud, disciplined, and stubbornly principled society, a society that clung to its identity even as its effectiveness faded. And there's a certain poetic quality to that decline. Sparta did not collapse in a dramatic, violent spectacle, though it certainly experienced battles and setbacks. It faded gradually, quietly, like a disciplined candle slowly burning down. Its 3,000 bad decisions were not a single catastrophic blunder, but the sum of countless small choices, rigid policies, overconfidence, stubborn adherence to tradition, and a refusal to adapt. Every abandoned infant, every phalanx maneuver, every delayed diplomatic negotiation contributed in small increments to the slow decline of a once dominant power. And there's a certain poetic quality to that decline. Sparta did not collapse in a dramatic, violent spectacle, though it certainly experienced battles and setbacks. It faded gradually, quietly, like a disciplined candle slowly burning down. Its 3,000 bad decisions were not a single catastrophic blunder, but the sum of countless small choices, rigid policies, overconfidence, stubborn adherence to tradition, and a refusal to adapt. Every abandoned infant, every phalanx maneuver, every delayed diplomatic negotiation contributed in small increments to the slow decline of a once dominant power.
Legends, myths, and the lasting shadow of Sparta. Welcome back, gentle listener. If you followed along this far, you've met kings, generals, soldiers, infants, ephors, and a society obsessed with discipline, appearance, and the occasional questionable decision. Tonight, we drift into the softer light of history, the myths that grew around Sparta, the stories we tell ourselves about the 300, and the real legacy of a city-state that was equal parts brilliance, stubbornness, and human error. Let's start with the most famous myth, Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans. Hollywood, poets, and motivational posters have immortalized these men as near-perfect warriors, standing resolutely against overwhelming odds. The truth is, they were heroic, yes, but also part of a larger Greek contingent numbering in the thousands. And yes, they died because they were outnumbered and strategically cornered. But their courage was not the only factor at play. It was also luck, terrain, timing, and the stubbornness of every Spartan leader who insisted on facing the enemy with honor or on your shield. The myth emphasizes perfection, but the reality reminds us that human lives and choices are messy, even under disciplined regimes. Sparta's legacy is complicated by exaggeration and romanticization. Philosophers like Plutarch and Xenophon wrote about Spartan virtues, bravery, discipline, and simplicity. Later generations admired these qualities, often glossing over the harsher realities, the abandoned infants, the constant fear of helot uprisings, and the rigid social hierarchies that excluded so many.
The result is a cultural image of Sparta as an idealized warrior society, immortalized in stories and textbooks, yet only partially aligned with historical fact. Even the Spartan miracle of discipline has to be viewed in context. Yes, their phalanx formations were disciplined. Yes, their agoge produced effective warriors. But this was achieved at tremendous cost. Personal freedom, population growth, and societal flexibility. Sparta's system worked beautifully for a time, but only under a narrow set of conditions, and only while the city-state remained isolated and insulated. Once variables changed, population decline, foreign innovation, or unexpected defeats, the system's brilliance became a liability. Part of what keeps Sparta fascinating is this dual nature, heroic on one hand, flawed on the other. They are admired for their courage, efficiency, and unique social organization. Simultaneously, they are a cautionary tale about rigidity, overconfidence, and the limits of a society designed around a single, narrow purpose. In other words, they inspire respect and mild exasperation in equal measure. Sparta also left a lasting imprint on military thought. Generations of soldiers and strategists studied their formations, discipline, and tactics. The phalanx, the emphasis on training from childhood, and the integration of social norms with military obligations influenced armies long after Sparta itself faded from prominence. But while these elements were innovative, they were also context-specific. Attempting to copy Sparta in a different era without accounting for social, economic, or technological changes often led to predictable failure. Culturally, Sparta's values have resonated through art, literature, and modern media. Stories about Spartan courage, discipline, and sacrifice are cited as examples of idealized heroism. Yet the fascination often ignores the quotidian realities, the pressure, the fear, the social exclusion, and the small daily missteps that made up most Spartan life. In this way, Sparta becomes a kind of bedtime story for adults, thrilling in concept but quietly sobering in reality. There is also the paradox of Spartan simplicity versus complexity. Outwardly austere, inwardly intricate, Sparta was a society where every decision, from birth inspections to military campaigns, was layered with ritual, expectation, and social pressure. This tension created both brilliance and brittleness. The discipline that allowed a phalanx to stand firm also prevented flexibility when facing new challenges. The heroism that inspired stories also contributed to a slow accumulation of errors, the 3,000 bad decisions that subtly undermined the city over centuries. Finally, the enduring fascination with Sparta is perhaps best captured in the contrast between myth and reality. The city-state is celebrated for courage, discipline, and heroism, but its actual history is messy, human, and occasionally absurd. Children trained to be warriors, kings making questionable decisions, helot uprisings, failed diplomacy, and overconfidence in battle all contributed to a society that was remarkable, yes, but not perfect. The tension between what Sparta was and what it became in legend keeps historians, storytellers, and dreamers alike returning almost hypnotically to its sun-baked streets and disciplined barracks. So as we gently drift to the end of this part, imagine Sparta not as a flawless warrior utopia, but as a living, breathing society, brilliant, stubborn, disciplined, flawed, and full of small, cumulative errors. It's a story of courage and misjudgment, of heroism and absurdity, and of a civilization whose perfection was always tempered by the slow accumulation of human imperfection. In the quiet of the night, with the image of Spartan warriors frozen in time, we can reflect on their legacy, a civilization that dared to organize itself around a single ideal, succeeded spectacularly at times, failed quietly at others, and left behind a story that is still captivating centuries later. It is the perfect combination for a long, slow, thoughtful narrative, the kind of history that whispers to us while we drift to sleep.
Scandals, eccentricities, and quiet missteps. Welcome back, patient listener. So far, we've wandered through kings, generals, the agoge, battles, decline, and the lasting myths of Sparta. Tonight, we slow our pace further to explore the smaller, quieter, and sometimes absurd aspects of Spartan life, the personal quirks, scandals, and eccentricities that rarely make it into the polished history books, but contribute quietly to the 3,000 bad decisions vibe. Let's begin with the quirky personal habits of Spartan leaders. Kings and generals were expected to be paragons of virtue, discipline, and courage, which sounds exhausting if you stop to think about it. Some leaders, unsurprisingly, found ways to bend the rules in small but telling ways. Excessive drinking, brief indulgences in comfort, or private jokes at council meetings, they were subtle rebellions against the strict norms. Nothing catastrophic, perhaps, but cumulatively, these small lapses shaped perceptions and occasionally led to minor political embarrassment. It's hard to imagine a king spilling wine on his ceremonial robes and not facing quiet judgment for a week. Spartans also had some unusual social practices. For instance, communal living arrangements in barracks for men were intended to foster camaraderie and discipline. In practice, this meant constant monitoring, peer pressure, and a culture where personal privacy was minimal. Boys trained together, ate together, and slept in close quarters, which occasionally led to awkward social dynamics, minor conflicts, and surprisingly inventive forms of subtle sabotage. Imagine trying to nap quietly while someone across the room misplaces your sandals deliberately, and you begin to see how small social errors could accumulate. Spartan ritualized violence, while largely ceremonial, also produced eccentric and sometimes scandalous outcomes. For example, boys in the agoge were encouraged to steal food for survival training, but caught stealing, they were punished. This created an environment of what modern psychologists might call contradictory reinforcement, where learning the lesson required simultaneous disobedience and compliance. It's a little chaotic, a little clever, and a touch absurd. Add to this the social pressure to perform heroically in minor competitions, and you have a culture where minor scandals could emerge from almost any routine activity. Spartan public humiliation was another form of quiet mischief that doubled as social control. Whether it was failing a physical test, tripping during a ritual, or showing inadequate courage, citizens could face ridicule from peers and elders alike. The intent, of course, was to reinforce discipline and conformity. The result? A society hyper-aware of mistakes, small and large, where every minor blunder was magnified and remembered. Over time, these tiny embarrassments accumulated into a culture of subtle anxiety and strategic overcompensation, which contributes to our 3,000 bad decisions tally in an almost invisible way. Sparta also had unusual mating and family practices. Marriage was often less about romance and more about duty, inheritance, and maintaining the elite citizen class. Couples might sleep apart, and the state could exercise influence over procreation to ensure strong children. While practical from a societal standpoint, these arrangements occasionally produced odd family dynamics, resentment, or awkwardly detached relationships.
Young men trained in the agoge, mothers managing households, and children raised under rigid discipline formed a complex web of social tension, quiet, invisible, but cumulatively significant. We should mention minor military scandals that rarely make the textbooks. Small failures in drills, miscommunications during minor campaigns, or disagreements among officers sometimes led to embarrassing outcomes. A unit might arrive late, misplace equipment, or accidentally provoke a neighboring city-state unnecessarily. These events were rarely catastrophic, but in a society obsessed with discipline, even minor errors were magnified, remembered, and occasionally recorded as cautionary tales. Another quiet eccentricity involved diet and lifestyle choices. Spartans prized austere meals and physical toughness, yet some indulged secretly in richer foods, wine, or leisure activities. These little indulgences weren't usually revolutionary, but they did contradict the society's publicly celebrated ideals. Over time, a pattern emerges. A culture that demanded perfection in public, tolerated small deviations in private, and quietly punished anyone whose minor mistakes became visible. Sparta also had its share of bureaucratic quirks. The ephors, 5 elected officials, wielded significant power but could also become petty, vindictive, or overly cautious. Decisions were sometimes delayed for procedural reasons. Personal grudges influenced minor policy, and occasionally, a bureaucrat would insist on ritualistic adherence to rules that made little practical sense. These small administrative errors compounded over time, slowing responsiveness and creating frustration. Small misjudgments that, when multiplied, became another thread in the tapestry of cumulative bad decisions. Sparta also had its share of celebrated eccentric individuals who defied norms in ways both amusing and instructive. Some soldiers developed peculiar training habits, generals preferred odd strategies, and philosophers occasionally mocked Spartan rigidity while remaining tolerated insiders. These individuals introduced unpredictability into a society designed for uniformity, demonstrating that even in the most disciplined environment, human behavior is delightfully unpredictable. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine a day in Spartan life. A boy stealthily sneaking through the barracks, a general quietly worrying about a minor council disagreement, a king indulging in a forbidden comfort, ephors side-eyeing each other over trivialities, and families navigating complex, state-imposed expectations. Each of these small moments, when multiplied over generations, contributed subtly, quietly, and inexorably to the 3,000 bad decisions that history remembers with gentle irony. Sparta, in its perfectionist, disciplined brilliance, was simultaneously heroic, flawed, and occasionally absurd. It is in these quieter eccentricities, the scandals no one shouts about, the social pressures no one celebrates, and the minor mistakes and human quirks that we glimpse the fully human, slightly chaotic heart of a society often remembered only for its brilliance.
Culture, education, and the quiet side of Spartan life. Welcome back, gentle listener. We've already wandered through kings, generals, children in the agoge, battles, decline, and eccentricities. Tonight, we float into a quieter, slower part of Sparta's story, the cultural, intellectual, and surprisingly thoughtful side that doesn't always make the headlines, but still shaped the lives of its citizens. Let's start with education beyond the agoge. While Spartan boys were trained to be soldiers, their intellectual development was not entirely neglected. Reading, writing, poetry, and basic philosophy were included, although they were clearly considered secondary to military training. Some historians suggest this was because Spartans valued practicality over abstract thought. Ideas were useful if they could enhance discipline, strategy, or civic cohesion. In other words, philosophy was fine, as long as it didn't distract from forming a perfect phalanx. Interestingly, poetry and song were integrated into military life. Songs of courage, communal songs during meals, and poetry recited for training purposes were common. These weren't just morale boosters, they reinforced cultural values, social cohesion, and a sense of collective identity. Imagine young boys learning to recite heroic verses while carrying heavy shields. Educational, musical, and physically exhausting all at once. Sparta clearly believed in multitasking before it was trendy. Spartan philosophical engagement was subtle but real. Thinkers like Plutarch later admired Spartan virtues, and within the city, elders and citizens engaged in discussions about ethics, strategy, and civic duty. Debate and reasoning were allowed, though carefully constrained within acceptable limits. Questioning authority too strongly was discouraged, yet controlled intellectual activity helped maintain cohesion and identity. It's like allowing a gentle breeze in a sealed room, enough movement to keep things alive, but not enough to disrupt the structure. The arts, while not Sparta's pride, were present in ceremonial and decorative forms. Pottery, minor sculptures, and functional art often reflected Spartan values: simplicity, austerity, and heroism. Unlike Athens, where extravagance and flamboyant design were celebrated, Sparta favored minimalism. Decorations and objects were symbolic, functional, and occasionally elegant, but never indulgent. Think of it as utilitarian art. Beautiful, yes, but designed to serve society, not the ego. Education for Spartan girls is also worth noting. Unlike in many Greek city-states, Spartan girls received formal instruction in reading, writing, athletics, and social management. Their intellectual and physical training prepared them to run households, manage property, and influence society indirectly. This emphasis produced strong, capable women who often outshone their male counterparts in administrative competence. The irony, of course, is that these educated, strong women had to live in a society obsessed with male heroism and ritualized discipline, a subtle tension that produced both admiration and occasional humor in historical accounts. Sparta's culture also included religious observances intertwined with daily life. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals reinforced social cohesion, morality, and military readiness. Religion was both a personal and civic duty, shaping decisions from minor household choices to major strategic moves. Mistakes in ritual could be embarrassing or politically awkward, though rarely catastrophic. It's easy to imagine a young boy accidentally performing a chant incorrectly, only to receive gentle scolding and later remembering it as a minor but formative lesson in Spartan order. Another subtle element was social storytelling and moral instruction. Legends, myths, and historical anecdotes circulated to teach courage, loyalty, and obedience. Unlike theatrical performances in other Greek city-states, Spartan storytelling was understated. No loud drama, no excess, just quiet lessons delivered in monotone or calm recitation. These narratives reinforced collective values and subtly guided behavior, creating a society where both small and large decisions were influenced by long-standing tales of heroism, caution, and occasional absurdity. Even in these cultural and intellectual pursuits, the 3,000 bad decisions pattern quietly emerges. Choices about which philosophies to encourage, which rituals to prioritize, or how to balance intellectual and physical education all had subtle consequences. A poorly timed lesson, an overly harsh punishment, or a mismanaged festival might seem trivial, but cumulatively, these minor misjudgments shaped social cohesion, morale, and the capacity for effective decision-making across generations. By the end of this exploration, we see that Spartans' culture was layered and deliberate, yet fragile. Intellectual pursuits were allowed but constrained. Artistic expression was minimal but functional. Religious and moral lessons were omnipresent, subtly guiding citizens' decisions. And every minor choice about education, a song, a ceremony, or a storytelling accumulated over centuries into a complex societal structure that could be brilliant, heroic, and stubbornly flawed all at once. So as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine the quieter, reflective side of Spartan life. Boys and girls learning not only to fight, but to recite, reason, and move with purpose. Elders quietly debating ethics, citizens participating in understated ceremonies, and a society whose intellectual and cultural choices, while subtle, contributed to the slow accumulation of minor errors, eccentricities, and carefully managed perfection. Sparta, in all its austere glory, was not merely a military powerhouse. It was a society of ideas, rituals, and cultural habits, where even small decisions about a poem, a song, or a lesson rippled through generations, contributing in their quiet way to the 3,000 bad decisions that history remembers with gentle irony.
Diplomacy, espionage, and strategic missteps. Welcome back, patient listener. We've meandered through kings, soldiers, the agoge, eccentricities, culture, and intellectual pursuits. Tonight, we float into Sparta's more social side, how they dealt with other city-states, tried to negotiate, and occasionally made choices that were, in hindsight, less than ideal. Sparta, famously disciplined on the battlefield, was considerably less graceful in diplomacy. Their approach was simple: project power, demand respect, and hope others obeyed. This worked for a while, especially when Athens was busy elsewhere, or when smaller city-states were easily intimidated. But diplomacy is rarely a simple matter of intimidation, and here is where many of the 3,000 bad decisions quietly pile up. Take the Peloponnesian League, Sparta's main alliance network. It was intended to consolidate power and coordinate defense, but maintaining it required constant negotiation, favors, and occasional coercion. Spartans' representatives often relied on blunt authority rather than subtle persuasion. Allies could be irritated, rebellions might simmer unnoticed, and occasional delays in providing support caused friction. This created a paradox. Sparta projected invincible strength, yet internally, managing its allies demanded careful skill that was often lacking. Spartans also experimented with espionage and intelligence, though it was less refined than modern standards. Scouts, spies, and informants were used to monitor enemy movements or potential helot uprisings. However, reliance on rigid reporting structures and strict hierarchies sometimes slowed intelligence dissemination. A timely warning could arrive too late, or a minor misunderstanding might escalate unnecessarily. In other words, even secret operations could generate quiet misjudgments that had subtle, long-term effects. A charming pattern emerges with strategic miscalculations. For instance, when Sparta intervened in Athenian politics or tried to influence smaller city-states like Argos or Megara, they often underestimated local dynamics. Their approach, firm instructions, occasional intimidation, and military presence, was effective only if locals were inclined to comply. When locals resisted, the result was drawn-out conflicts or diplomatic embarrassment. Think of it as showing up to a polite dinner with a cannon instead of a handshake. Impressive, but socially awkward. Spartans' naval engagements provide another layer of minor disasters. Not traditionally a seafaring power, they occasionally launched fleets to challenge Athens or secure supply routes. These expeditions were often hastily prepared, with inexperienced crews, and sometimes poorly timed. Ships might arrive late, formations might falter, or supplies run short. In some cases, victories were achieved, but they came at disproportionately high cost, or with diplomatic fallout.
These campaigns are subtle reminders that even a disciplined, rigid society struggles when operating outside its natural comfort zone. Spartan diplomacy was also complicated by internal politics. Decisions about alliances or interventions had to pass through kings, ephors, and councils. Conflicting opinions could delay responses or produce contradictory actions. In some instances, a Spartan ally might be left waiting. Another city might misinterpret intentions, and what was intended as a display of power turned into confusion. Small misjudgments compounded over years, adding to the long, slow accumulation of errors we've been following all along. Minor miscommunications are everywhere in Spartans' foreign affairs. Orders might be interpreted differently by different generals. Messages could be delayed, misread, or misrepresented. Sometimes, a supposedly simple plan, reinforce an ally here, blockade a city there, became a chain reaction of logistical errors, minor humiliations, and unnecessary expenditure of resources. In essence, Spartans' legendary discipline sometimes couldn't overcome the very human tendency to miscommunicate. Even when victories were achieved, long-term consequences could be subtle but important. Subdued cities occasionally rebelled, allies grew resentful, resources were drained, and internally, citizens who observed these missteps could quietly question the infallibility of leadership. Sparta's rigidity, once an advantage, became a liability when minor strategic errors accumulated over decades. And then there's the understated irony of Spartan foreign policy. A society that trained for perfection in war often fumbled in politics. Their bravery and discipline were unquestionable, yet their interpersonal and interstate decision-making frequently suffered from rigidity, overconfidence, and the occasional misjudgment. Every minor diplomatic error, an ally insulted, a city neglected, a fleet poorly coordinated, added quietly to the 3,000 bad decisions tapestry. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine the Spartan diplomat, king, or general negotiating with allies, sending spies, or launching minor interventions. Each choice carries weight, each misstep is amplified by rigid social expectations, and each small failure subtly shifts the course of history. It is in these quieter, strategic miscalculations that we glimpse the full complexity of Sparta. Disciplined, heroic, stubborn, and often quietly flawed. In summary, Spartans' foreign affairs were not dominated by catastrophe or triumph alone. They were a series of careful, disciplined decisions, each tinged with the potential for subtle error. This combination of skill, rigidity, and human imperfection produced a society that was impressive in principle, heroic in certain moments, and quietly prone to the accumulation of mistakes, those very 3,000 bad decisions that echo across history.
The twilight of Sparta and its lasting echo. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, and subtle missteps. Tonight, we drift into the final act of Sparta's long story, not in dramatic collapse, but in slow, deliberate fading, and the lingering echoes that continue to fascinate historians, writers, and dreamers alike. Sparta's decline was neither sudden nor catastrophic. Unlike some city-states that fell violently, Sparta faded gradually. Population continued to shrink, political rigidity persisted, and the cumulative effect of the 3,000 bad decisions quietly manifested in reduced military power, diminished influence, and occasional humiliating defeats. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta was no longer the dominant land power in Greece. The Thebans, under Epaminondas, had shattered the myth of invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra. Athens had rebuilt its influence in the classical period, and Macedonia was rising,
bringing new military innovations and political strategies that rendered Sparta's rigid, infantry-focused model increasingly anachronistic. The city-state could still muster warriors, still inspire stories of courage, but its practical influence was waning. Despite this decline, Sparta remained culturally and symbolically significant. Writers, philosophers, and later historians admired their discipline, social cohesion, and martial spirit. The Spartan ideal, the warrior, the citizen trained from birth, the disciplined society, became a model for reflection, inspiration, and sometimes parody. Sparta's history was taught as both an example of disciplined genius and a cautionary tale about rigidity and isolation. Interestingly, Sparta's memory outlasted its political power. Roman writers, for example, admired their courage and simplicity. Even when the city-state could no longer project force across Greece, its legend inspired militaries, political thinkers, and storytellers. Every Spartan phalanx, every ritualized sacrifice, and every minor decision that went slightly awry became part of a cultural narrative. Perfection admired, human error acknowledged, subtle irony intact. The final centuries of Sparta were marked by survival rather than expansion. The city-state negotiated carefully with stronger powers, maintained its customs, and continued the agoge tradition for as long as it could. Life went on quietly, rituals, training, governance, but with diminished resources, reduced population, and a smaller sphere of influence. Yet the cultural framework, the austere homes, disciplined routines, communal training, and moral expectations remained intact. In a way, Sparta became a living museum of its former self, intact, disciplined, and quietly fragile. Sparta's long-term legacy is found in its paradoxes. On one hand, it was a society of remarkable discipline, military innovation, and social cohesion. On the other, it was inflexible, prone to minor errors, and ultimately limited in adaptability. Modern historians can admire their achievements while noting the accumulation of small misjudgments that eventually undermined their dominance. The 3,000 bad decisions are less about catastrophic failures and more about the slow, almost imperceptible consequences of rigid systems, eccentric customs, and human quirks repeated across generations. Culturally, Sparta continues to inspire. Literature, film, and popular imagination often focus on the 300, Thermopylae, or the agoge, but the quieter stories, the small human missteps, and the eccentricities of daily life are what make the historical Sparta truly compelling. It is a society where heroism and folly, discipline and stubbornness, greatness and minor absurdities coexist in perfect tension. As we gently drift toward the close of this part, picture the final centuries of Sparta. Elders reviewing rituals, young men training quietly, families observing customs, ephors deliberating over minor disputes, and the city-state slowly adapting to an evolving world that it could no longer dominate. Each action, each tradition, each subtle decision, sometimes brilliant, sometimes flawed, added to a tapestry of human experience that continues to captivate centuries later. Sparta's story ends not with fireworks, but with a quiet, deliberate fading. Yet its memory remains vivid. The lessons are subtle. The power of discipline, the limitations of rigidity, the heroism of small communities, and the accumulation of small errors that quietly shape the fate of even the most formidable societies. In the end, Sparta is both legend and cautionary tale, a society of enduring fascination, quietly flawed brilliance, and yes, thousands of small but meaningful missteps.
Historians, misconceptions, and the 3,000 bad decisions. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, children, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, and the slow fading of Sparta. Tonight, we float into a quieter, reflective corner of history. How Sparta has been recorded, interpreted, and mythologized by generations of historians, writers, and storytellers. Sparta, as you may have noticed, is a favorite subject for historical exaggeration. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, Xenophon, and Herodotus, often blend observation with moral lesson, political bias, or literary flourish. Stories of perfect phalanxes, heroic sacrifices, and unbroken discipline were compelling, but rarely objective. Even minor eccentricities could be magnified into anecdotes illustrating virtue or folly. This has contributed to the modern fascination with Sparta's flawless reputation, alongside the ironic acknowledgement of their cumulative mistakes. Modern historians have worked to separate myth from reality. Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, and the Agauge are frequently cited, but context is essential. Yes, Spartan soldiers were disciplined. Yes, they trained rigorously. But they were also human, prone to misjudgments, occasional cowardice, minor miscommunications, and bureaucratic inefficiencies. The 3,000 bad decisions we've been following are a blend of historical reality, human imperfection, and the natural quirks of an isolated, rigid society. One major misconception is the idea that Sparta was monolithically warlike. While military prowess defined much of their culture, they also engaged in diplomacy, trade with neighbors, and cultural activities. Poetry, music, and ritual had real social significance, even if overshadowed by swords and spears. Ancient writers sometimes downplayed these softer aspects because they didn't fit the heroic narrative, another subtle misjudgment that influences how we perceive Spartan decisions today. Sparta's rigidity and discipline are often romanticized, but historians note that these qualities had limits. Overconfidence, bureaucratic delay, and inflexible strategies contributed quietly but steadily to setbacks. Modern interpretations of these mistakes often frame them as moral or philosophical lessons rather than isolated incidents, a cautionary tale about societies that excel in one area but neglect adaptability. Interestingly, historical accounts themselves were sometimes biased. Writers sympathetic to Athens or Thebes emphasized Spartan failings, sometimes exaggerating incompetence or cruelty. Others admired their discipline, highlighting heroism while glossing over minor errors. The result is a patchwork of impressions. Sparta as perfect warrior society, Sparta as stubbornly flawed, Sparta as tragic, heroic, and amusing, all at once. It's the perfect narrative for a sleepy, reflective bedtime story, which explains why we keep coming back to it centuries later. Modern culture has continued this duality. Movies, books, and popular histories often focus on dramatic moments, Thermopylae, the Agauge, heroic battles. But scholars digging quietly through archaeology, epigraphy, and ancient texts uncover subtler truths. Helot management crises, population decline, failed diplomacy, minor bureaucratic errors, and social quirks. These small, accumulated choices are just as telling as the famous heroic acts, and they form the backbone of our 3,000 bad decisions narrative. Sparta's enduring fascination comes from this tension between myth and reality. On one hand,
We admire bravery, discipline, and innovation. On the other, we chuckle gently or sigh quietly at stubbornness, minor missteps, and human foibles that persist even in highly organized societies. The lessons are subtle but rich. No matter how disciplined or heroic a society may appear, human choices, small, repeated, and cumulative, always leave a mark. Historiography also reminds us that perception shapes legacy. Sparta's image, carefully curated by writers and reinforced by popular culture, often obscures the mundane, bureaucratic, or eccentric aspects of daily life. Scholars work to reconstruct reality by reading between the lines, analyzing patterns, and acknowledging both brilliance and folly. Every small administrative error, misjudged alliance, or minor social blunder becomes part of a larger, quieter tapestry, the human story behind the legend. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine the historian, centuries later, sifting through texts, artifacts, and myths. Each choice in recording, interpreting, or dramatizing Spartan life subtly influences our modern understanding. The cumulative effect? A society simultaneously heroic, disciplined, flawed, and endlessly fascinating. A civilization that achieved greatness, but also quietly accumulated thousands of small, imperfect decisions. In short, Sparta's story is as much about how we perceive it as what it actually did. The 3,000 bad decisions are not just historical events. They are the echo of choices, human imperfection, and the interpretive lens of generations who marveled at both their discipline and their quirks. It is this layered, nuanced perspective that makes Sparta endlessly captivating, quietly instructive, and perfectly suited for our slow, reflective exploration.
Sparta in context, comparisons, and quiet lessons. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now we've explored kings, warriors, the agog, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, decline, and historiography. Tonight we float into a broader perspective, how Sparta measured up against other city-states, what they did well, and where their accumulation of minor misjudgments quietly shaped outcomes. Let's begin with Athens, Sparta's most famous contrast. Athens prized democracy, trade, philosophy, and artistic expression, often at the expense of rigid discipline. Sparta prized discipline, austerity, and military excellence, often at the expense of flexibility. Athens could innovate politically and intellectually, but sometimes suffered from indecision and internal conflict. Sparta was decisive, disciplined, and impressively stable, but rigid and prone to minor errors that slowly accumulated. Comparing them is like comparing a fast, improvising runner to a slow, steady weightlifter. Each excels in its own domain, and each has weaknesses. Sparta also differed from Thebes, particularly in the classical period. Thebans, like Epaminondas, innovated tactically and strategically, demonstrating flexibility and creativity on the battlefield. Sparta, by contrast, relied heavily on traditional phalanx formations and strict military doctrine. These differences highlight the subtle cost of rigidity, disciplined consistency versus adaptive innovation. Sparta's minor missteps, miscommunication, delayed responses, overconfidence, accumulated quietly, while Thebes exploited flexibility to score decisive victories. When compared with Persian or Macedonian empires, Sparta's scale and resources were limited. They could produce elite soldiers, yes, but logistical constraints, population decline, and economic austerity restricted sustained campaigns. Persia and Macedonia, with more diverse resources and strategic flexibility, often outmaneuvered Sparta. The lesson is subtle. Excellence in a narrow domain does not guarantee supremacy in a complex, interconnected world. Minor errors, overconfidence, delayed coordination, underestimating rivals, compound when operating at a larger scale. Even within smaller Greek city-states, Sparta's choices sometimes stand out. Their rigid social hierarchy, strict gender roles, and obsession with martial training were exceptional. In other societies, flexibility, trade, and social mobility mitigated minor mistakes or absorbed shocks. Sparta's rigid system, while impressive in ideal conditions, left little room to recover from small errors, making every misstep more significant. One can also draw lessons from Sparta's longevity and eventual decline. Despite accumulating minor errors, miscommunications, population problems, and occasional strategic misjudgments, Sparta persisted for centuries. Their disciplined institutions, social cohesion, and shared values allowed them to endure far longer than many other city-states that might have been wealthier, more flexible, or more populous. The subtle lesson: consistency, identity, and cohesion have remarkable staying power, even when errors quietly accumulate. Another perspective is the human factor. Sparta demonstrates that even highly organized societies are subject to the quirks, eccentricities, and limitations of individuals. Small administrative missteps, minor social faux pas, or individual eccentricities, what we've been gently labeling as the 3,000 bad decisions, interact with broader systemic factors to shape outcomes. Other city-states, while perhaps less disciplined, benefited from greater adaptability, allowing them to absorb human error more easily. Sparta also teaches a quiet lesson about myth, memory, and selective admiration. While Athens is often celebrated for democracy and philosophy, and Thebes for military innovation, Sparta is remembered for discipline, heroism, and endurance, even when minor errors quietly undermined practical effectiveness. Comparisons remind us that societies are judged as much by what we admire in hindsight as by the sum of their decisions in real time. And finally, when we step back, a subtle pattern emerges. All societies face the accumulation of small errors. Sparta is simply an illustrative case because of its extreme structure, narrow focus, and extensive documentation. Other civilizations, Rome, Persia, Athens, and Thebes, also experienced minor missteps, miscommunications, bureaucratic blunders, and social quirks. Sparta's story is compelling because their rigidity magnifies the consequences of these small choices, creating a slow, observable ripple effect across centuries. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine Sparta alongside Athens, Thebes, Persia, and Macedonia, a disciplined, stubborn weightlifter surrounded by fast, adaptive, improvising runners. Each society has strengths and weaknesses, and each experiences minor mistakes that quietly shape its trajectory. Sparta's genius was consistency, its folly, rigidity. Its cumulative missteps remind us that history is never about single catastrophes. It is a slow accumulation of small, human choices, repeated over generations, sometimes heroic, sometimes flawed, and always instructive. In summary, Sparta's story, when placed in context, illuminates the quiet interplay between excellence, rigidity, and human imperfection. Comparing it with other city-states shows how minor misjudgments accumulate differently depending on flexibility, resources, and societal priorities. And, as always, it leaves us with subtle, reflective lessons on discipline, adaptation, and the persistent human tendency towards small, consequential errors.
Sparta under Roman shadow, survival and subtle decline. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, decline, historiography, and comparisons with other city-states. Tonight, we float into a quieter, reflective era, Sparta under the shadow of Rome, its slow absorption into larger empires, and the subtle survival of its cultural legacy long after political dominance faded.
When Rome emerged as the dominant Mediterranean power, Sparta was already a shadow of its former self. Population had dwindled, military prowess was less formidable, and the rigid institutions that had once ensured cohesion now slowed adaptation. Rome, with its bureaucratic efficiency, professional army, and sprawling networks, viewed Sparta with a mix of admiration and bemusement. A city that once terrified the Greeks now became a curious relic, remarkable, quaint, and largely irrelevant in strategic terms. Despite diminished power, Sparta retained cultural prestige. Roman historians, writers, and travelers admired their discipline, austerity, and enduring customs. Martial values were particularly appealing to Romans, who themselves prized military virtue. Tales of Spartan heroism, the agoge, and the heroic 300 were retold, adapted, and subtly romanticized. Minor errors, eccentric customs, and human quirks were often glossed over, leaving the impression of an almost timeless exemplar of discipline, a clever, selective remembrance that conveniently ignored centuries of quietly accumulated missteps. Even under Roman rule, Spartan social structures lingered. The ephorate had largely faded, kingship persisted in diminished form, and elements of the agoge were preserved as cultural tradition, if not as practical military preparation. Citizens still adhered to austere lifestyles. Families maintained ceremonial practices, and communal values persisted. Yet these structures were increasingly symbolic rather than functional, a cultural shadow of the city's former martial brilliance. The very rigidity that once enabled Sparta's dominance now slowed integration into the wider Roman world. Roman Sparta also faced economic and demographic pressures. With trade dominated by other cities and population concentrated elsewhere, Sparta could no longer sustain large-scale military campaigns or rigorous training for the masses. Wealth and population declined, while elite families maintained prestige through heritage rather than power. Minor misjudgments, whether in resource allocation, adaptation to new governance, or maintaining civic morale, accumulated quietly, further reducing the city's practical influence. Interestingly, Spartan cultural survival outlasted its political or military relevance. Roman visitors were often fascinated by the persistence of Spartan customs, boys in training, girls engaged in athletics, communal meals, and austere lifestyle practices. These practices served as living reminders of the city's legendary past, even as Rome reshaped the political and economic landscape. The Spartan story, in essence, became more performative than practical, a society preserving the appearance of discipline, heroism, and collective virtue, while quietly navigating new realities under imperial rule. During the Hellenistic period, Sparta experienced additional shifts. Macedonian influence, followed by Roman intervention, introduced new political dynamics. Sparta's military was no longer the decisive force it had been. Its citizens increasingly participated in ceremonial, symbolic, or defensive roles. Minor strategic missteps, delays in adaptation, underestimation of external powers, and rigid adherence to tradition accumulated, further highlighting the contrast between former glory and present reality. Yet even as Spartan influence waned, its mythic aura persisted. The image of the disciplined warrior, the austere citizen, and the heroic city never completely faded from memory. From a cultural perspective, Spartan identity was remarkably resilient. Religion, ritual, communal training, and social cohesion continued to define everyday life, even in a city politically dominated by Rome. These practices were subtle but meaningful. They preserved moral and civic codes, maintained group identity, and transmitted values to future generations. In a way, the 3,000 bad decisions we'd been tracing were less about catastrophic errors now, and more about the cumulative consequences of rigid structures slowly encountering an adaptive, changing world. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine Roman-era Sparta. Citizens walking austere streets, elders discussing ritual and tradition, young men and women maintaining training and customs, all under the watchful eyes of distant Roman officials. Each choice, whether to preserve a custom, adapt a ritual, or maintain austere discipline, was small, cumulative, and quietly consequential. Sparta was no longer a dominant power, yet its cultural echo persisted, subtly shaping perceptions, inspiring admiration, and reminding the world of the curious balance between brilliance and human imperfection. In summary, Sparta, under Roman influence, teaches a quiet lesson. Political power may fade, but cultural identity can persist far longer than practical dominance. Minor misjudgments and accumulated errors subtly transform the society, yet the essence, discipline, heroism, and adherence to tradition remains. It is a testament to resilience, human complexity, and the enduring fascination of a city that, while diminished, continues to captivate centuries later.
Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've journeyed through kings, soldiers, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, decline, historiography, comparisons, and survival under Roman rule. Tonight, we float into the world of stories, myths, and cultural memory. The way Sparta has been remembered, celebrated, and sometimes misrepresented in literature and modern imagination. Sparta's literary legacy begins in antiquity. Plutarch, Herodotus, Xenophon, and others painted a picture of a society at once disciplined, heroic, and morally instructive. The Agoge, Thermopylae, and the austere lives of Spartan citizens were depicted with reverence, moralizing undertones, and occasional exaggeration. Minor mistakes, bureaucratic blunders, and eccentricities were downplayed, while virtue, courage, and discipline were highlighted. In other words, the narrative we inherited was curated, quietly emphasizing heroism over human error. Greek myth and legend further reinforce this selective memory. Stories of Lycurgus, the semi-legendary lawgiver, present Sparta as a society shaped by divine wisdom and extraordinary discipline. In these tales, human misjudgments are minimized, structural rigidity is glorified, eccentricities become quaint anecdotes rather than cautionary tales. This created a template for the heroic, infallible Sparta that continues to influence cultural imagination. During the Roman period, admiration of Sparta persisted. Roman writers often contrasted Spartan virtue with Roman indulgence, using Sparta as a moral benchmark. Minor errors, small strategic misjudgments, and eccentric customs were either overlooked or reframed as charming quirks of an ancient, disciplined society. In essence, the Roman perspective transformed Sparta into a symbol of timeless martial and civic virtue, gently smoothing over the imperfections that quietly accumulated across centuries. Fast forward to the modern era, and Sparta becomes a cultural touchstone for heroism, resilience, and martial prowess. Literature, theater, and film focus on Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, and the austere life of the Agoge. Historical novels dramatize their valor. Movies amplify their heroism. Popular histories celebrate discipline. Yet minor errors, human quirks, bureaucratic limitations, and social eccentricities are rarely central. The myth is heroic,
the flaws invisible or conveniently ignored. Even in philosophical and political discourse, Sparta is often cited as an example of disciplined governance and civic virtue. Educators, military strategists, and moralists reference Spartan training, communal cohesion, and austere values. The subtle, cumulative mistakes, the 3,000 bad decisions, rarely enter the conversation, creating a selective lens that highlights strength while obscuring quiet, human imperfection. Interestingly, modern fascination with Sparta often reinforces the very myths historians have questioned. Graphic novels, video games, and popular culture celebrate the heroic, the austere, and the extreme. Training, discipline, and courage are amplified, but bureaucratic inertia, minor strategic errors, and social eccentricities are minimized or omitted. It's a perfect example of how storytelling shapes perception. What is remembered is heroic. What is forgotten is subtly instructive. And what accumulates quietly over time is rarely noticed. Even subtle forms of humor appear in cultural portrayals. The austere, disciplined citizen becomes almost caricatured in modern retellings, unyielding, serious, and obsessively rigid. Minor eccentricities, small social missteps, and human errors are transformed into narrative devices, amusing quirks rather than meaningful lessons. These portrayals preserve the essence of Sparta while simultaneously obscuring the accumulated consequences of its decisions. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine Sparta as both historical reality and cultural symbol. Disciplined soldiers marching in perfect phalanx, citizens practicing austere rituals, historians quietly noting small errors, storytellers amplifying heroism, and modern audiences celebrating courage while overlooking subtle misjudgments. The tension between myth and reality, heroism and quiet folly creates a layered, enduring fascination. In summary, Sparta's presence in literature, myth, and modern culture illustrates how selective storytelling shapes our understanding. Heroism is amplified, flaws are minimized, eccentricities are charmingly noted, and minor errors, those cumulative 3,000 bad decisions, become invisible footnotes rather than central lessons. Yet these footnotes remain, quietly informing historians and attentive observers of the human imperfection underlying even the most disciplined societies.
Lessons from Sparta: leadership, society, and quiet imperfection. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've meandered through kings, soldiers, eccentricities, culture, diplomacy, decline, historiography, comparisons, Roman influence, and cultural memory. Tonight, we gently reflect on the lessons Sparta offers, lessons about leadership, societal organization, and the subtle, cumulative consequences of human imperfection. Sparta's most obvious lesson is discipline matters. Their society demanded rigorous training, moral focus, and communal cohesion. In modern terms, this translates to the value of consistency, preparation, and shared values in any organization. Yet, as we've observed, discipline alone is not a cure-all. Even a meticulously structured society accumulates small errors, and these errors, while individually minor, can shape outcomes over generations. The 3,000 bad decisions remind us that no amount of order can fully eliminate human fallibility. Another lesson is the importance of adaptability. Sparta excelled in infantry warfare, but struggled when circumstances changed. Naval campaigns, diplomacy, and interactions with flexible powers like Thebes or Macedonia highlighted their rigidity. In modern contexts, this translates to the need for flexibility and strategic thinking. No system, however disciplined,
thrives if it cannot adjust to new information or shifting conditions. Minor misjudgments, when compounded by inflexibility, have quiet but meaningful consequences. Sparta also illustrates the power and limits of collective identity. Citizens were bound by shared values, rituals, and expectations. This cohesion enabled remarkable feats of cooperation and endurance. Yet it also created blind spots. Minor eccentricities, bureaucratic delays, and strategic misjudgments were magnified because individual initiative was constrained. Modern societies and organizations can learn from this tension. Cohesion is valuable, but overconformity can amplify small errors. Leadership lessons emerge as well. Spartan kings, ephors, and generals were expected to be decisive, disciplined, and morally exemplary. Yet even leaders accumulated small mistakes. Delayed responses, miscommunications, or rigid interpretations of rules. Leadership requires both strength and discernment, a balance between decisiveness and flexibility. Minor oversights may seem trivial, but as Sparta shows, they can quietly shape the trajectory of a society or organization. Sparta's cultural and intellectual pursuits offer additional insight. Education, music, poetry, and ritual reinforced social cohesion and moral values. Even if practical utility was limited, these pursuits created a resilient identity and preserved values across generations. In modern terms, investing in culture, ethics, and shared narratives strengthens long-term cohesion, while neglecting small human needs or eccentricities can lead to unnoticed decline. There is also a lesson in perception versus reality. Sparta's reputation often exaggerates perfection while minimizing eccentricities and missteps. Modern organizations, leaders, or societies can fall into the same trap, emphasizing success, heroism, or discipline while ignoring the accumulation of small errors, misunderstandings, or human quirks. Awareness of these subtleties, acknowledging both strength and fallibility, is essential for sustainable growth. Finally, Sparta teaches the subtle power of legacy. Though their political influence waned, their cultural, literary, and symbolic impact persisted for centuries. Small actions, rituals, and traditions continued to shape perception long after their practical relevance faded. Minor decisions, repeated over generations, quietly echo in cultural memory, another reminder that even seemingly insignificant choices have long-term consequences. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine a modern organization, society, or leader absorbing Spartan lessons, disciplined but adaptable, cohesive but flexible, attentive to culture and ritual, acknowledging minor mistakes, and shaping long-term legacy. Each small choice, strategic, social, or cultural, accumulates, quietly influencing outcomes in both visible and subtle ways. In summary, Sparta offers enduring lessons. Discipline is essential but insufficient alone. Adaptability is crucial. Cohesion amplifies both strengths and weaknesses. Leadership requires discernment, and minor decisions quietly shape legacy. The 3,000 bad decisions are not failures in isolation. They are a slow, cumulative narrative of human imperfection, resilience, and the quiet wisdom that emerges from careful reflection.
The Spartan military, decline, symbolism, and modern reflection. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, culture, diplomacy, Roman influence, literature, lessons for modern life, and more. Tonight, we float into the quieter, reflective domain of Sparta's military legacy, how their famed army declined over time,
and why it continues to fascinate modern imagination. Sparta's military system, the legendary phalanx and agogia combination, was once unmatched in Greece. From early adulthood, male citizens trained rigorously, internalizing discipline, teamwork, and endurance. This produced remarkable results: victories in key battles, dominance over neighboring city-states, and the enduring myth of invincible warriors. Yet, as we've traced, rigid systems have limits. By the 4th century BCE, subtle cracks in Sparta's military structure began to appear. Population decline meant fewer citizens available for service, while dependence on Helot labor created social tension and occasional revolts. Training continued, but numbers dwindled. Strategic misjudgments, delayed adaptability, and overconfidence increasingly hampered operational effectiveness. Minor errors, improper coordination, miscommunications, delayed reinforcements quietly accumulated, undermining what was once a nearly flawless system. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE is often cited as a turning point. The Thebans, under Epaminondas, innovated tactically, exploiting Spartans' rigidity. Sparta's legendary phalanx, previously near invincible, was outmaneuvered. Yet even in defeat, the story emphasizes heroism and discipline rather than mistakes, a narrative pattern we've observed throughout Spartan history. Subtle errors, underestimating flexibility, adhering too rigidly to tradition, were present but overshadowed by the symbolic aura of bravery and order. Over subsequent centuries, Spartan armies became smaller, less influential, and more ceremonial. Military exercises persisted as tradition, but they were increasingly symbolic, preserving appearance and ritual rather than projecting decisive force. In effect, Sparta had transformed its military system from practical supremacy to cultural iconography, a disciplined performance echoing past glory. Modern military thought continues to study Sparta, but often selectively. Leadership, cohesion, training, and unit loyalty are emphasized, while minor misjudgments and structural limitations are often glossed over. Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, and disciplined phalanxes serve as case studies in courage, endurance, and teamwork, but rarely as lessons in rigidity or slow decline. The subtle accumulation of minor missteps, population limitations, and adaptation failures are quietly noted by historians, yet largely invisible in popular imagination. Popular culture amplifies this selective memory further. Movies, video games, novels, and media portray Spartans as nearly superhuman warriors, disciplined, heroic, and infallible in battle. Training is extreme, courage is absolute, and flaws are minimal or charmingly quirky. The reality, a small society gradually declining, adapting slowly, and accumulating minor errors, is conveniently edited out. This selective narrative reinforces heroism while obscuring quiet lessons about rigidity and cumulative misjudgments. Yet there is value in this symbolic resonance. The Spartan military, in both historical and mythic form, illustrates the power of discipline, cohesion, and shared purpose. Modern militaries and organizations often study Sparta, not for flawless execution, but for inspiration. The idea that rigorous training, unity, and moral clarity can produce extraordinary results. The quiet lessons, adaptability, population management, attention to small errors are subtle but crucial for informed analysis. As we drift toward the close of this part, imagine a Spartan phalanx, disciplined, orderly, and intimidating, yet subtly vulnerable to evolving tactics and slow societal changes. Behind the legend lies a society that trained its citizens rigorously, maintained cohesion for centuries, and yet quietly accumulated small errors that eventually limited its dominance. The phalanx stands as both symbol and caution, inspiring, heroic, and quietly flawed. In summary, the decline of Sparta's military system demonstrates the interplay between discipline, rigidity, and the accumulation of minor errors. While their army became less decisive over time, its symbolic power persists in modern thought and imagination. Heroism is celebrated, mistakes are minimized, and the lessons are subtle. Preparation and cohesion are powerful, but adaptability and awareness of small, cumulative errors are equally essential.
The Spartan economy, helots, and societal balance. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, diplomacy, decline, cultural memory, military symbolism, and lessons for modern societies. Tonight, we float into the quieter structural side of Sparta, its economy, the helot system, and how these underpinned both military prowess and societal misjudgments. The Spartan economy was unusual, even by Greek standards. Spartans prioritized land-based wealth and subsistence agriculture, relying heavily on helots, an enslaved population tied to the land. These helots produced the food and resources that allowed Spartan citizens to train, fight, and maintain austere lifestyles. On paper, this seems efficient, a free warrior class supported by laborers. In practice, it was a delicate balance, prone to quiet miscalculations. Helots were essential, but also dangerous. They vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens, creating a constant undercurrent of tension. Every generation faced the possibility of rebellion, requiring careful surveillance, psychological intimidation, and occasional punitive measures. Minor administrative errors, failing to supply enough overseers, misjudging loyalty, or underestimating dissatisfaction could have severe consequences. Even when crises were avoided, the constant vigilance imposed subtle constraints on Spartan flexibility. Spartan citizens were prohibited from engaging in most commerce or trade. This limited their exposure to wealth accumulation, trade networks, and external markets. The upside was focus. Time, energy, and attention could be devoted to military training and social cohesion. The downside? Economic rigidity, reliance on helots, and vulnerability to resource shortages. Small missteps in resource management could quietly accumulate into significant societal stress, exacerbating the 3,000 bad decisions we've been tracking. Taxes and redistribution were minimal because Spartans eschewed material accumulation. Citizens were expected to maintain modest households, while communal rituals and military obligations absorbed much of their time and attention. While admirable in theory, this structure depended heavily on population stability and helot productivity. Any demographic shift, agricultural failure, or minor administrative misjudgment could ripple quietly through the system, affecting military readiness and social cohesion. The agriculture-helot relationship also had moral and psychological consequences. Citizens were trained to be disciplined, courageous, and austere, but constantly reminded of their dependence on a subjugated population. Minor lapses in oversight, miscommunication with helot overseers, or underestimation of discontent could escalate tensions. Rebellions, even small ones, required significant resources and attention, subtly diverting energy from military campaigns or internal administration. In essence, the economy and social hierarchy were intertwined with military and political life, and minor errors accumulated quietly over generations. Trade and external engagement were limited. Spartans avoided extensive commercial activity, unlike Athens or Corinth, prioritizing self-sufficiency and simplicity. This insulated them from some external pressures, but also limited flexibility and adaptability.
Small miscalculations in resource allocation or in responding to outside economic challenges could have amplified effects, quietly undermining long-term stability. Interestingly, Spartan economic and social rigidity reinforced cultural norms. Citizens internalized austerity, obedience, and communal values. At the same time, this rigidity magnified the consequences of minor errors. A mismanaged harvest, a neglected helot grievance, or an administrative oversight could quietly affect military readiness, social harmony, and political stability. The economy, military, and social systems were intertwined, creating a subtle, cumulative chain of decisions, most of them small, some of them consequential, and all quietly shaping Spartan history. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine the Spartan landscape. Helots tending fields under vigilant oversight, citizens training rigorously, overseers monitoring every detail, and elders deliberating on resource allocation. Each small decision, how to deploy labor, manage crops, or enforce order, interacts with military preparedness and social cohesion. Minor errors accumulate, echoing through generations, quietly shaping the trajectory of one of history's most disciplined societies. So, in summary, the Spartan economy and helot system illustrate the delicate balance between labor, resource management, social structure, and military readiness. Dependence on a subjugated population, combined with economic rigidity and austere citizen life, created a society capable of remarkable feats, but also prone to quietly accumulating small errors. Discipline, cohesion, and austere lifestyle remain central, yet the subtle misjudgments embedded in daily management contributed quietly to the 3,000 bad decisions that have fascinated historians for centuries.
Sparta's religious life, rituals, festivals, and quiet influence. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've explored kings, soldiers, culture, economy, helots, military decline, historiography, and the enduring lessons of Sparta. Tonight, we float into the quieter ceremonial world of religion, festivals, and rituals, how they structured daily life, reinforced social cohesion, and occasionally led to subtle miscalculations. Spartan religion was, like much of Spartan life, highly communal, disciplined, and integrated into everyday routines. Citizens worshipped a pantheon similar to other Greeks, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, but the emphasis was often on civic virtue, military favor, and communal observance rather than private piety. Temples, altars, and sacred spaces were carefully maintained, not only as spiritual centers, but also as sites reinforcing civic identity. Festivals were integral to Spartan life. Events like the Gymnopaedia, a festival of athletic displays, music, and ritual dances, were designed to celebrate physical prowess and collective identity. Young men performed coordinated exercises, demonstrating discipline, endurance, and unity. Girls, too, participated in athletic and ritual competitions, highlighting the importance of physical fitness and moral preparation. These ceremonies reinforced social cohesion, ensured continuity of cultural norms, and subtly prepared citizens for the demands of military and civic life. Religious rituals also intersected with social hierarchies. Priests and elders guided ceremonial observances, offering subtle oversight of communal behavior. Even minor lapses, a mispronounced prayer, a poorly executed dance, or a scheduling error could be noticed and corrected, reinforcing the disciplined culture. These were small, cumulative interventions that contributed to a broader system of order and cohesion. Spartan religion also interacted with military preparation. Certain festivals and rituals coincided with training periods, reinforcing discipline and focus. Young men learned to coordinate actions, perform under scrutiny, and internalize collective norms.
Religious ceremonies and athletic displays blended spiritual, civic, and martial functions, a subtle but effective means of social engineering. Yet this integration was not without risk. Scheduling conflicts, mismanagement of resources, or misjudgments in coordination could disrupt cohesion, requiring careful oversight. Again, minor errors quietly accumulated, shaping outcomes in ways rarely dramatic, but always consequential. Interestingly, Spartan festivals also provided opportunities for subtle political messaging. Leaders could demonstrate authority, reinforce social hierarchies, or subtly address tensions, especially with the helot population, through ceremonial acts. Decisions about timing, scale, or ritual detail, while minor in isolation, had cumulative consequences for morale, loyalty, and perceived legitimacy. Even ceremonial miscalculations could ripple quietly, affecting social balance or communal morale. So as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine a Spartan festival. Young men performing choreographed dances, priests observing rituals carefully, citizens participating in austere celebrations, and elders monitoring each detail. Each action, timing a sacrifice, supervising athletic contests, ensuring proper ritual observance, is small but meaningful. Minor errors are corrected, repeated over generations, quietly shaping cohesion, tradition, and the subtle accumulation of societal decisions. In summary, Spartan religious life, festivals, and rituals were more than spiritual expression. They were tools of social cohesion, moral reinforcement, and subtle governance. Discipline, observation, and communal participation minimized major crises, yet the accumulation of small errors and minor misjudgments quietly shaped outcomes across generations. Through religion and ritual, Sparta reinforced identity, maintained social harmony, and added another layer to the 3,000 bad decisions that defined this remarkable, disciplined, and quietly flawed society.
Spartan women, influence, culture, and quiet power. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've meandered through kings, soldiers, diplomacy, economy, helots, military decline, religion, rituals, and festivals. Tonight, we float into the intriguing world of Spartan women, their social role, cultural influence, and subtle impact on military and societal decisions. Spartan women were unusually empowered compared to other Greek city-states. They could own property, inherit land, manage households, and oversee estates, especially during times when men were away training or campaigning. This economic independence was practical. With so many male citizens occupied by military obligations, women became essential to social stability and resource management. Their decisions, while often quiet and domestic, accumulated over time, subtly influencing Spartan society in significant ways. Physical fitness was also emphasized for women. Athletic training, running, wrestling, and dancing were part of their upbringing. This served multiple purposes: maintaining health, encouraging strong offspring, and fostering a culture of communal discipline. Minor missteps in training or oversight could affect future generations, demonstrating once again that even small actions quietly ripple across time. Socially, Spartan women influenced culture, morale, and military ethos. They were expected to encourage bravery, maintain pride in lineage, and reinforce communal values. Famous sayings, such as mothers telling their sons to return with your shield or on it, reflect not just cultural expectation, but active reinforcement of military virtue. Their involvement was subtle, indirect, but consequential. A misjudged message, a lapse in ceremony, or neglect in training
could quietly alter morale or cultural transmission. Marriage and family arrangements were also unique. Spartan women often married later than women in other city-states, allowing for more education, physical development, and social involvement. These minor deviations from broader Greek norms contributed to population stability, healthy offspring, and ongoing cohesion, though errors in matching or oversight could quietly accumulate social or familial tension. Interestingly, Spartan women also interacted with helot management. While they did not directly oversee labor, their household responsibilities, property management, and social influence affected helot administration indirectly. Misjudgments in resource allocation, supervision, or household management could quietly compound broader societal challenges, reinforcing the subtle chain of 3,000 bad decisions. Cultural influence extended into religious and festival life. Women participated in rituals, dances, and ceremonies, reinforcing social cohesion and maintaining tradition. Their decisions, how rituals were performed, how celebrations were managed, or how young citizens were guided, had cumulative impacts, shaping social norms and expectations. Even minor errors, unnoticed in isolation, contributed to the slow evolution of societal practices. So, as we drift toward the close of this part, imagine Spartan women in daily life overseeing estates, participating in ritual dances, encouraging young citizens, reinforcing pride and discipline, and subtly shaping military and social culture. Each action, small, quiet, and often indirect, interacts with the broader fabric of Spartan society, producing both cohesion and, occasionally, minor ripple effects of oversight or misjudgment.
The final decline and enduring legacy of Sparta. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, we've wandered through kings, soldiers, diplomacy, economy, helots, religion, women, festivals, military decline, and cultural memory. Tonight, we float toward the final chapters of Spartan history, its gradual absorption into larger powers, and the subtle, enduring impact it left on human imagination. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta had long ceased to dominate militarily. Population decline, rigid social structures, and reliance on helots limited its ability to project power. Macedonian influence reshaped regional politics, and Rome's growing presence slowly absorbed Greece into a larger, bureaucratic empire. Spartan independence became increasingly symbolic rather than practical, a quiet echo of former glory. Political power continued to wane. Kings retained ceremonial authority, and ephors maintained some oversight, but decision-making increasingly deferred to larger hegemonies. Minor administrative misjudgments, generational rigidity, and social conservatism compounded over time, reducing Spartan's practical influence. By the Roman period, the city-state existed more as a living museum of discipline and austerity than as an active player on the Mediterranean stage. Yet Spartan's cultural and symbolic legacy persisted. Roman writers, traveling scholars, and later European historians marveled at its discipline, moral rigor, and legendary heroism. Stories of Thermopylae, the Agoge, and communal valor were preserved, celebrated, and adapted, while minor errors and quirks, those quietly accumulated 3,000 bad decisions, remained largely invisible to broader audiences. Sparta became a moral exemplar, cautionary tale, and romantic ideal all at once. Even as it faded politically, Sparta influenced modern thought. Military theorists, political philosophers, educators, and cultural storytellers draw lessons from its discipline,
cohesion, and endurance. Yet attentive historians remember the subtle warnings. Rigidity limits adaptability. Minor errors quietly accumulate, and even a disciplined society can decline without flexibility or innovation. Sparta's history offers both inspiration and instruction, quietly teaching the consequences of human decisions repeated over generations. Social and cultural remnants lingered as well. Spartan festivals, ritual practices, and communal ideals influenced neighboring regions and survived in literary and philosophical memory. The example of empowered women, disciplined citizens, and structured training left traces in educational theory, military training, and cultural narratives for centuries. Each seemingly small choice, from property management to ritual timing, contributed to the long-term endurance of Spartan identity, even as political power dissipated. Symbolically, Sparta became a lens through which the world could reflect on heroism, discipline, and the accumulation of human imperfection. The legendary 300, the agoge, and austere citizens illustrate both excellence and limitation. Minor mistakes, bureaucratic oversights, social quirks, and accumulated misjudgments were largely invisible in heroic retellings, yet they quietly shaped every generation of Spartan society. The interplay of discipline and imperfection is the story's enduring charm. So, as we drift toward the close of this long exploration, imagine Sparta in its final days. Elders preserving rituals, citizens maintaining austere routines, helots tending fields, and the city quietly absorbed into larger empires. The phalanx is ceremonial, the agoge symbolic, yet the memory persists. A society that excelled, endured, stumbled quietly, and left an indelible mark on history. In summary, Sparta's final decline illustrates the quiet reality of human societies. Political power fades, cultural memory persists, and minor decisions accumulate to shape long-term outcomes. The 3,000 bad decisions remind us that history is often the sum of small, repeated human choices, both heroic and flawed. Sparta remains enduringly fascinating because it exemplifies discipline, resilience, and subtle imperfection, a civilization that continues to inspire reflection, moral lessons, and gentle, sleep-inducing stories centuries later.